And so I want to let you know that we're going to present an overview of background to what we did to get to this work, why the focus on freshmen, and then dive into some of the features we've identified related to freshman supports and the examples of those systems, data, and practices. We've divided the webinar where I'll do the first half, so you're lucky you don't have to hear me the whole hour. And then Mimi will pick up in the second half of the session. And our plan is to be fairly informal, so please use the chat box to ask questions. When either of us are presenting, the other person will try and watch the chat box and respond to as many questions as we can as they arise, as opposed to waiting to key points in the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and get started talking a little bit about the background to where we're at. So we arrived at this after been working for a number of years implementing high school positive behavior support in a lot of high schools across the country. And what we continually found were those schools were struggling with freshmen, and the data with freshmen always was going not necessarily in the same direction as the rest of the school. We started by going back to the literature and kept ending up in the school engagement literature, which makes sense. I mean, what we want to do is have kids ready to learn and be engaged in school during that freshman year so that they can continue on through their 4 years and graduate on time. We also found a number of research studies when we looked at the other side, which was around dropout and school failure, that when they interviewed the students about why they had dropped out or were failing in school, they often talked about these same kinds of issues. There are a number of models on school engagement. We just happened to decide to select this one by Fredericks and his colleagues that focuses on 3 primary areas: behavioral, cognitive, and emotional. And you can see they each kind of focus on areas that are a little bit different. But you'll see this thread of this type of...
Anybody need more time? All right. We're going to get moving here.
Okay, so
we'll be done here shortly. We got 2 more sections to do.
If whoever is speaking could mute themselves, I can't find you in the attendance box. Thank you.
Okay, so besides the school engagement, as I mentioned, we also looked at our work from school-wide PBIS and that framework, because that's where we had started work. So what you'll see as we go through this presentation, if you're already implementing school-wide PBIS, you just kind of fold this in, or you can use this as a strategy to start even implementing school-wide PBIS in your high school and build from this to your upper grades. So that's kind of a little bit about the background and kind of the foundation we use, both the school-wide school engagement literature and the school-wide PBIS framework. Is there any questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat box, but I'll wait a couple minutes before I move on. Okay. One of the questions we often ask is this a new initiative? And as I mentioned, it's not. When we work with freshmen, we're still trying to implement the features behind PBIS about being predictable, consistent, positive, and safe. It's just that you're going to see there's much more emphasis on the freshmen than potentially the other students. And that's because these are a vulnerable population. Whenever you start a new initiative, you're going to have to build commitment. And there's 2 levels of commitment: initial commitment and maintaining commitment. These are kind of words to the wise after having done this for a while and learning from other schools. Don't assume that just because you're excited about freshmen and ready to put time and energy behind freshmen, that all of your staff will feel that way. Or just because you're only working with freshmen, that you don't need to gain the other staff's support and commitment. because by working and emphasizing and focusing on freshmen, you're going to shift your resources at different points in time. And if you haven't gotten a full school-wide commitment to these freshmen, you're going to get pushback from the other teachers. So make sure that all are on board. So make sure that all your staff, and go back, even if you've been implementing school-wide PBIS with Fidelity, I encourage you to go back to your staff and emphasize and get a commitment to shifting some of your support and resources towards your freshmen. I'm going to focus today just a little bit on initial commitment. And in particular, the first one is why freshmen. When you're trying to get commitment initially from your faculty, one of the things you're going to have to help them is understand why freshmen. There's a couple ways we've been doing this. One is by sharing your school data. Usually if you disaggregate your data by year, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, you'll find your 9th graders' data have lower attendance rates, often higher course failure, etc., if you're at all like the national norms. And so it's very easy to show to them this is a struggling group of students, and there's a whole lot more of them than you would be able to deal with by intervening individually or through targeted interventions. You also can talk to them then about what resources are already being absorbed from the administrative or support services to help those freshmen that might be able to be redirected elsewhere. The second way we've dealt with freshmen and getting that message about why freshmen is to share data statements from the literature. I don't have time to go through this activity, but we've included all the slides so that you can do it with your staff. Basically, we've pulled statements from the literature about the effectiveness and success or failure rate of freshmen. And we asked the staff to, in small groups or as a whole group, to look at these statements and decide which one they think are fact or fiction. And if they think it's fiction, what would they change to make it more of a fact? The next slide shows you the answers to those questions, and then we show those individually and have a conversation around these. It really brings the awareness level to those general rest of the faculty who don't work with freshmen about why this is an important, not just for freshmen, but will impact their classes and as they see them as sophomores, juniors, and seniors. But really what's most important is that they get the message that 9th grade is a critical year and that it's not just a small number of students who are struggling, it's a lot of students who are struggling, and they're struggling not just academically, but also behaviorally. And so we really need to work to get those freshmen off on the right start and the right foot. So you really are using this activity to set up that message that it's about we need a universal intervention as opposed to trying to deal with it as a tier 2 or a tier 3 support intervention. We have included all the references so that if you wanted to go back to any of those articles and find sentences that are more relevant to your school or your context, because making things contextually relevant also helps others buy in and identify with the information you're giving. You could also look at your state data and use some statements around that as well to bring relevance to your school. The other thing in getting initial is to make sure they understand the effectiveness of approaching it from a universal or a multi-level system of support. I know you as a state use that already within your behavior and academics, so it may just be reframing it and using your language that you're using within your district so they can see how this fits into the same framework and the importance of doing universal when we have so many freshmen that are struggling. It's also important to make sure you have district and your administrative commitment to focus on freshmen. You're going to need that specific time, and you're going to also need often the shifting of resources, whether that be personnel or just some general funding or even just scheduling changes or access to students. So I encourage you to make sure that you've checked on that commitment as well before you go full force ahead. Fourth is, one thing about high schools is, as you all know, you have lots of initiatives. Oftentimes those are building initiatives, but more often they're also coming from the district or from the state through the district. It's going to be really important that you think about how your work with freshmen will help that initiative in the potentially career and college ready standards and meeting those, meaning graduation requirements or benchmarks that you've set, decreasing attendance that's been set by the district, and those kinds of things. So I encourage you to spend some time looking at those initiatives you have and how your work with freshmen or the data about your freshmen align with those efforts. Last and just as important is the WIFM factor, which is what's in it for me. We often talk a lot about the students and what they need and how we can support them better, and I think that's important. But the other way to get commitment is to also be sure to emphasize what it is that those students will regain by implementing some of the practices and putting some of the systems in place in your schools. And those can be things such as through their classroom routines, time for instruction, increase in self-efficacy, etc. And for the upper grades, what it means is better prepared students, and if the administrative staff isn't spending all of their time interacting with and solving problems for freshmen, you'll see them also have more time to deal with and support them in some of the efforts that they may want to have. Last is something called yeah buts when we train with our high schools in general and also on the freshman work. And that's really something that you all know and are near and dear to your heart. As you start these initiatives, there's always the pushback. Yeah, but we couldn't do it because of this. Or yeah, but they should just know how to do it. You know what your yeah buts are from your local contacts, and you need to focus on what those are, talk amongst yourself, and get those conversations of a response down to a couple of minutes so that you can have that conversation with that peer as you're walking from the copy machine back to your classroom between classes. So prepare for all of your yeah buts. I put a couple slides through here that are food for thought. We don't have time to have lots of conversations around these today because of the short time period, but these are things that we'd encourage you to go back and have conversations back in your school and with your teams, if you already have a team, to talk about your level of commitment, or in this case, or your how you're going to build that commitment. I have a question in the chat box about how many schools are forming houses of students. I don't have a standard number across country or anything, but a number of the high schools we work with do have freshman teaming, or have houses in which they have operated the system. But we've also operated it within, worked with freshmen in which there is no teaming in place. So now I'm going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of the presentation. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we have aligned this work with the PBIS work because we're often called into schools that are using and trying to implement school-wide PBIS. I believe there may be some of you on the phone who are just starting this effort or haven't begun it. So I'm hoping that you so there will be information in which I'm going to briefly go over that you may need to get more information from Michelle and Liz and others about the details of these. What I'm going to try and do is go through these first four leadership team through acknowledgments and just talk a little bit about how that looks a little bit different when you start to integrate freshmen, focus on freshmen into your PBIS work, or if you're just starting out, how you would integrate it into the general implementation of PBIS. So anybody who's familiar with PBIS knows there's a school-wide leadership team that is made up of people who are knowledgeable about the school, the students, have the expertise that's needed, and have an administrator or someone who can make immediate decisions. That's no different for the freshman leadership team. We recommend that you set up some type of team that's really their primary focus is on the systems, data, and practices for freshmen because of the amount of time and energy it might take to make some decisions and have a model, a group that you can quickly gather. They're going to have the same effective meeting strategies that we would expect of any school-wide leadership team. In the implementation of PBIS, you have a school-wide team that's across all grade levels, and you all have upper-tier teams, sometimes as joint tiers. Some schools do them as separate tiers. And that would all still be in place. What we're recommending is you add a 9th grade team. But that 9th grade team has to be in ongoing conversation with the school-wide team because the school-wide team is still responsible for all students. It's just that they can look more intensely or drill down more around 9th graders. So make sure if you do set up a 9th grade team that you are continuing it back and forth to your school-wide team. Freshman leadership team, and it looks, responsibilities look very similar to those of the school-wide leadership team in that they're responsible for implementing those systems and practices, and they're also responsible for monitoring the fidelity and the outcomes. As a result, they're really about scaffolding and emphasizing that freshman team so they get the attention that they need as a group. Second item after leadership team on that figure was the use of data for decision making. In the PBIS, I'm going to talk primarily about outcome data here, and maybe later we'll talk to you about fidelity data. When you're working in school-wide PBIS, you primarily talk about social behavior and the collection of that data. Social behavior alone won't be enough. Schools that are doing RTI around literacy and math may talk about academic performance, but in the high schools we really get down to course performance. Things such as GPA, as well as course failure, homework completion, summative evaluation, those kinds of things. And then there's attendance, which is also a major issue in high schools. So skips and tardies, but also unexcused and excused absences. It's amazing when you start to look to aggregate your data and you look at excused versus unexcused absence, how much time students are missing from instruction, even if it was an excused absence by the parents or by the school. We refer to these as our ABCs and encourage schools to look at all three of these areas. The inclusion of these two additional areas and a focus on them will be a challenge. Very rarely does a school have a data system that integrates all three of those. I was looking this morning, Michelle or Liz was sent me your Wisconsin data set, and you actually may. It looks like you may be able to access this data through that system, but you may not be able to look at. I couldn't tell whether you could look at them as an integrated system where you can look at both attendance and course performance at the same time. So what percentage of our students are performing lower than the benchmark we had set, but are attending class? That's a different group of students and needs a different kind of system and practice than those that aren't attending and are low performers. So that makes it a little bit more of a challenge than in other systems. So watch for the interaction of that. And it may take some time initially for that team to really understand these data and get the data in a format that you can use them to make decisions. This is an example of a data system that a local school did, where they took the traditional, you hear school-wide PBIS, where you set up with levels of different kinds of problem behaviors and use those as benchmarks. And they've gone ahead and benchmarked across a number of different variables. Again, this benchmarking just helps them know when they should be concerned when a certain percentage of their kids are off track or are on track. But the other thing to think about is don't drown in your data. You can look at a lot of data in high school, and you're going to need to really pick out and focus on what's important to you as a district or what's been set for you as an important thing to watch by your state. As I said this morning, I got information about your Wisconsin dropout early warning thresholds. And so I encourage you, again, don't reinvent the wheel. You've got some set for you already. I encourage you to use these. I'm going to pull it up a second because I also, in playing around with a little, I can see you can get general information, but down here there's a cohort user guide. So this allows you to set up a cohort. So I'm assuming you can set up a cohort of just your freshmen, which would allow you then to get some of this data more easily just about your freshmen, whereas this other data looks like it's across all kids and all grades. So I'm sure you're way more familiar with it than I am, but I encourage you to use the data and the data systems that are available and then drill down with local systems when you need to. The last point around data is to don't just admire your data. We have a lot of literature that admires our data and the problems in high school. But our goal really is to make a difference for kids. This is a form we've used with our freshman teams where it helps them start with saying, what does that data say? And if they are concerned or worried about their data, what goal do they want to set to change that data? And then what practices do they need to put in place for students? And what do they really need to do in order to support the staff? So it makes sure that you're looking not just at your data, but you're moving that data forward to identifying practice for students, but of course, don't forget putting in systems in place in order to support those freshmen. Here's some food for thought around the leadership and the data components that I encourage you to go back and talk to your districts about. I'm going to pause a few minutes to see if there's any questions before I go on to the last two items. I'm going to close my presentation here talking about the last two sections around consequences and acknowledgments. Mimi and I tend to talk about these together and then delve more deeply into them separately. And the reason is that most often high schools have pretty strong systems for inappropriate behavior. They're discipline systems. That's not to say they don't need a little work here and there, but they're very much embedded in the culture of the high school. What we don't usually have a lot of in high school is acknowledgement systems for appropriate behavior. And if we do, they tend to be for those students who have high academic achievement that get acknowledged for their behavior. So one of the ways we want to share is that we tend to focus on this in our high school work as well as our freshman work, is to think about those as a system that requires both of those to be in place. So it's one consequence system, or two sides of the same coin, so that faculty can help keep those connected. And it does help with a little bit less pushback on the acknowledgments, because you're not just focusing on acknowledging kids. It's important, if kids aren't behaving appropriately, that we have a consequence system that works and decreases that, because in the end, you really want to increase the behaviors that you want and decrease those you don't want. And so they need to work together. So I encourage you to talk first about them and their relationship, and then delve into how you're going to correct an inappropriate behavior, and or how you're going to have a system that acknowledges appropriate behavior. For those of you, again, who don't have PBIS in place in your schools, you're going to probably need to develop these specifically for freshmen. There's very little we've seen different as we implement in the consequence systems, either the discipline and or the consequence systems for freshmen, except for one thing, and that's the fact that the students who are freshmen, because of their developmental age, they still need a higher frequency and a higher intensity of acknowledgments. There's a number of articles out there now indicating that even from the neuroscientists, that the reward system isn't as developed in those younger students as it is in adults. So the mantra we hear often about, well, they're adults, they need to act like adults. Well, they're not, they don't have that physical capability to be able to do that. And that applies to all freshmen. Just like we all know their judgment isn't exactly where it needs to be at this point. You're going to, same as with any consequence system, consider it tangible all the way through verbal and group and individual. And you're going to focus those acknowledgement systems on those specific areas that your school-wide data system says you need to attend to. So that takes you through very quickly through the first four systems. That, as you can see there, that leadership team, consequence, and acknowledgement is not much different than what you would implement in your school-wide PBIS team. The data for decision-making system is different. That's probably a whole webinar, so I just kind of briefly ran you through some things to think about. And I'm now going to turn this over to me.
Thanks, Brigid. So forgive us while we get the slides switched over here.
And thanks for everybody tolerating my voice for half hour.
Let's see. Here we go. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay? All right. So I'm going to pick up here. Brigid has given us an introduction to kind of the idea that really the features of the freshman supports that we're talking about today just mirror that of other multi-tiered systems of support that you are either implementing or thinking about implementing through the work you're already doing school-wide. And what we're going to focus in on now are this kind of narrowed-in freshman view of expectations and then also classroom systems. So when we get at the idea of identifying freshman expectations, we're really thinking about these are kind of layered on top of your school-wide expectations. So it's not a suggestion that you would come up with a whole new set of perseverance, acceptance, etc. Those things for freshmen. It's really trying to narrow down what are the specific knowledge and skills that you think freshmen need in your building to be successful. How we've come to talk about these is really how to do school. Oftentimes when we're working with schools, we hear them say the students just aren't prepared when they come. They didn't get these skills in middle school, or they're not ready. And so rather than continue to have that conversation, we just encourage schools to identify what are the knowledge and skills that would get them ready, and then go ahead and teach those. And so thinking back to, Brigid talked about this earlier, the notion of school engagement, and really thinking across all three of those domains, the behavioral domain, affective emotional domain, and then also the cognitive domain. So thinking about how can we not only give students the academic skills they need, but also the social skills to be able to navigate high school successfully, interact appropriately with teachers and so forth, and then to be able to feel connected to school somehow and feel like school belongs, is a place where they can belong, and they have peers and adults that they can go to if they need them for support. So all thinking about all three of those areas, and really the ultimate goal of what we're going for is to create self-directed learners. That's what we're hoping for when they come in the doors, and it's not always the case. So how can we get them there more quickly? And what the development of these expectations really is identifying what are we going to teach these guys to get them to be more self-directed learners. So what we've done here in our research group is develop a curriculum that we really tried to align, again, as I mentioned, with those three behavioral, cognitive, and emotional domains of school engagement. And so we identified things like how to be able to prioritize, how to use a planner, how to keep track in your classes to make sure that you're not falling too far behind, etc. And so it's just a conversation in your buildings to identify what would this look like for you. So if you don't have a full class period, what we've seen in some schools is that teachers, some of the schools we've worked with, were able to implement this in a freshman advisory class, let's say, or a freshman. We have one school that has what they call a freshman leadership class that all freshmen are taking. Oftentimes there are career class or career curriculum, other things being implemented in that class. And so that's obviously a really nice place to embed the lessons that you develop or that you adapt. There are lots of curricula out there around these skills. If you don't have the full class schedule or a full class period, we've seen other schools be able to utilize an assembly schedule by, every Wednesday for the first 6 weeks of class, let's say, implement an assembly schedule to be able to take a few minutes out of every class period so that during that assembly time, teachers can deliver these lessons to students, let's say. A rolling class is the similar notion where over the first few weeks of school, a different class period agrees to teach the lessons. Advisory schedule, we mentioned power hour is a neat way that some schools have done this where they, about once a week or twice a week, again in the beginning of the school year, they kind of borrow a few minutes from every class period so that each class period is equally giving up a certain number of minutes, and then they extend lunch. And so the lunch period becomes longer to enable students to be able to receive the curriculum during that time. And as I've described these, you've heard me say at the beginning of the year, in our experience implementing our curriculum, we've learned and gotten lots of feedback from teachers that it's better to kind of front load whatever your lessons are in the beginning of the year, rather than spread them evenly throughout. Because as we mentioned, these are skills we want our students to have early. For example, if we're teaching students how to use a planner, then we want them to learn to use that planner right out of the gates and not wait a month before we start teaching them how to do that. So the more we can front load these and the more we can find time early in the year to deliver these lessons that are in line with whatever our expectations are for freshmen, then we're going to be able to see that benefit a lot more quickly. The notion of, once you've identified that set of expectations, you go through the same process with these as you would with your school-wide expectations, and with any good teaching, quite frankly. Once you've defined them, there needs to be some explicit teaching of those, and those are the kind of the lessons I talked about. Our curriculum develops lessons. I think we're in the middle of a revision right now, but I think they are all about 30 to 35 minutes long, It's only about 12 lessons, and they explicitly teach those kinds of skills that we've identified, as I mentioned, that are in line with that school engagement. And then following the actual teaching, reinforcing becomes very important. And so we need to embed that language into our classes. We need to find ways that students are continually being reinforced and consistently being reinforced across the curriculum with whatever the content is that we've taught them. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. I did want to mention with the teaching to consider the use of upperclassmen, because the kids often, this won't come as any surprise to you, the freshmen are going to hear things differently from upperclassmen than they are from us as the adults. And so if upperclassmen can come in and either help teach the lessons or be involved as we have in the project we're currently working on, what we call peer navigators that are placed as kind of AAs, but they've been trained to be not quite a mentor, not quite a tutor, but really a coach, kind of an academic and how to do school coach in those classrooms. And so we're really trying to utilize the upperclassmen as much as possible, not only in teaching the lessons sometimes, but also in just ongoing work with the students, the freshman students. So again, there's just this cycle of identifying the content, teaching it, and explicitly then reinforcing it. So I wanted to take a quick pause here and give you the opportunity in the chat box to just throw out, brainstorm real quick about what knowledge and skills in your building would you say it's essential for freshmen to know and be able to do. So just type some of your ideas into the chat box. Great. I see study skills coming up. Always very important. Organization, time management. Great one. Seeking out teachers. So kind of self-advocating and seeking out teachers and having kind of productive conversations with teachers. Goal setting. Excellent. Knowing what they need to be on track for graduation. A lot of our students, of course, coming out of middle school, here's another one, understanding credits. They haven't thought about credits before, haven't had to figure out what that means and how you earn credits and so forth. We in our curriculum, for example, have a whole lesson around just how to read a transcript, because students just haven't had that exposure yet. Great, self-monitoring. So lots of good ideas out there. And these are going to change depending on your school context. And you may have, Brigid talked about initiative alignment. You may have other initiatives in your building that help guide and help narrow whatever your list of these skills is for your freshmen. So one thing that you will want to consider is alignment with those other initiatives. If you have a real big literacy push, for example, then you may want to help narrow down your freshman expectations to be really nicely lined up with your literacy initiatives. One of the things that's tempting is to come up with a laundry list of things that, a big long wish list of all the wonderful things that freshmen should be able to do to be successful. And just I encourage you to really whittle it back down to what's the smallest thing that we can teach them that's going to give them the most success in the long run. So things like study skills and interacting productively with adults, etc. If we can build that independence in those areas, it's going to serve them well in the long run. And so really, really going back and having those conversations around what's the smallest piece of information we can give these guys to help them become self-directed learners. And with that, we want to move on to kind of the notion of the classroom system. This is where that reinforcement comes in. So if we teach students, some of you guys' great suggestions around organization, for example. So if we teach students certain skills around organization, we want to be able to, as teachers, be doing things and expecting things in our classroom that support those skills, that support the use of those skills, so that students are not learning it in a one setting, but also transferring it among their classrooms. So some ways in which we do that are what we call teacher agreements. And this really is how we help create a more consistent, predictable environment for our freshmen. And it's one of the, I really like talking about these because it's one of the biggest bangs for our buck, if you will, with what we can do to support freshmen. Sometimes we can make a really small change in the way we run our classroom or in the way that we set certain policies, and it will really go a long way to support freshmen and their learning as they kind of learn to navigate high school in general. So these are some examples of what we are calling teacher agreements. I'll just run through a few of them. One that can have a huge impact is this very first one about posting lesson objectives and daily assignments. In some buildings, that's already an expectation. In others, my colleague Danielle and I were training some teachers on Friday, and this was a big topic of conversation for them. In some schools, this is an easy thing for people to do. In others, the building we were talking to, even this one was kind of a big hurdle for them to get over. And so the notion is that all freshman teachers would agree to post the lesson objectives and daily assignments in their classroom every day. And this, of course, makes it easier for students to know what the expectations are, what their homework is, etc. To go even further would be to place them in the same location in the classroom, in every classroom. So, for example, in the upper left-hand corner of the whiteboard. If that was the case in every classroom, imagine how that could, the impact that could have. So all of the new freshmen know exactly where to look for the assignment, and it removes barriers for them. So they no longer are searching or looking, or when you said it, I was not paying attention and now I don't have it. So it just eliminates all these barriers. It's a fairly simple conversation with teachers, and many teachers are already doing this. It's just kind of tightening it up and getting it in the same place. This could also go a long way if you're communicating with families, because families then know that the lesson objectives and daily assignments are posted every day in the upper left-hand corner of each whiteboard, and therefore, again, eliminates barriers, because as parents are talking to their students, they know exactly what the expectations are, and there's no excuse of, I didn't know what the assignment was. So you can see the kind of, it branches out into other areas beyond just supporting the freshmen singly in the classroom. Some others are a pre-failure protocol, so are teachers willing to agree to a few common steps that they're going to take when they notice that a student falls below a certain percentage. Let's say you say any student below 68% in any class will get a phone call home, for example. So something along those lines. Planner use, some people mentioned planners when we talked about skills that all freshmen should have. A planner use protocol in every class would again reinforce that skill. If we teach students to use planners, then we should expect them to use planners in all their classes. This one can be tricky, of course, because it takes a few minutes, and minutes are precious in high school. And so to try to convince teachers, to give up a few minutes every day or once a week to encourage students and try to support students in using planners. This student-led example, we had a school that all the teachers use this as their warm-up. And so a student would be leading on the document calendar the entry of assignments into the planner while the student is doing the start of the class. So this tricky minutes can also let the students really encourage students to use planners. The last one I'll do is great. This is a that really can go a long way as far as impact. If we want teachers to agree to update their grades by the 1st and 15th of the month, for example, that's just an example of some dates that are easy to remember. And the teachers then would agree to have their grades updated. Now, if you can imagine the ripple effect here, the students now know when they log into the online grading system, that their grades are accurate. So that's helpful. If you have support classes or support personnel who are working with students, they also know that the grades are accurate, so that those are good times to be checking grades and then making student plans based on that. And then your parents, again, your data folks know that that's when they should pull data to get an accurate read on how students are doing academically. So again, this is a conversation that has to happen in the building. Some buildings, this would be a difficult conversation, so it just depends on your staff and where you are, but it's something to think about. I saw in the chat box that someone wants to talk a little bit more about a pre-failure protocol. Yes, I'd be happy to talk for an extra minute about that. The notion here is that all the teachers would come to agreement on certain steps that they're willing to take before a student starts failing. And so the idea is to catch a student, you know, when they're kind of in the danger zone, let's say. If they're in the D zone or a low C zone, then, you know, there are certain steps that you would take. Would it be a meeting, a quick meeting with the student so that they know that, make sure that they know that their grade has dropped, make sure that they know what they need to do to improve. Oftentimes it's just that piece of communication. They're used to, again, in middle school, someone kind of pulling them along. And our goal here is not to continue to do that, but our goal is to scaffold, as Brigid said. So to build in some supports. And if we have a pre-failure protocol, even for just the first semester of 9th grade year, then they've built the skills and the knowledge. Oh, I need to be checking my grades more, or oops, I didn't realize I was falling behind in that class. And so if we help them along, then by second semester, we can start taking away some of those supports so that they're building independence. And that's true for all of these teacher agreements. That one thing you want to think about is the notion of we're not trying to build a crutch for them. We're trying to build those self-directed learners, but we need to support them as they're starting their new skills, kind of training wheels, if you will, and then eventually we take the training wheels off. And what that looks like will be different in your buildings based on, you know, what you decide as a team. Okay, and just note here about just whatever you choose, it needs to align with your expectations. So if you're back to the planner use, if you're teaching around planner use, you definitely need to have some agreements among teachers around supporting that planner use. It would be a waste of everyone's time to teach planners one day and then never revisit that. So you've got to build that in an ongoing system. One more note here about the pre-failure protocol and shifting responsibility to the student. This could be scaffolded in a way where for the first term, let's say, whether you're a trimester or quarter semester, teachers agree to go through this failure protocol. So if your grade drops below a 68%, we're going to have a quick conversation with you and let you know what assignments you're missing, and we're going to make a phone call home. But then in second semester, we're not going to make the phone call home, and we're not going to help you identify what you need to do to make things up, but I will give you a quick note that says, hey, you dropped below 68%. So that way they're building those skills across the way. So we're slowly removing the supports. And that may look different for different students, of course. If you've got a high-need student that needs more support, we don't want to just drop them. But this is, again, the universal conversation around pre-failure protocols. So in keeping with our time, I am going to move forward. So we talked about all 6 different features. And really it's helpful to think about them in groups. It can feel overwhelming to say, oh, there are all these different things we need to do. So Brigid talked about the leadership team and data for decision making, and those two really kind of hang together because the leadership team is primarily responsible for that. She mentioned the acknowledgments and consequences really being 2 sides of the same coin. And these, if you're already implementing a school-wide system, there's very little that changes at the 9th grade level. It's just a matter of putting ninth grade lens and really amping up those acknowledgments because we want to have a higher intensity and higher frequency of acknowledgments for ninth graders. And then finally, we just talked about, and again, these go very much hand in hand, those freshman expectations that you identify and teach, and then the classroom systems that work to support those, and how you really want to think of those as working together to support the freshmen and just to really provide that consistent, positive environment for them. So before we move on, Brigid mentioned us talking about fidelity. So I wanted to talk just for a few minutes about that. This is one of our favorite slides. Our colleague Kelsey Morris, who's now in Missouri, developed this, and it really shows the relationship between outcomes over here on the left and fidelity down here across the bottom. And so if you're a school with high outcomes and low fidelity, you're just lucky. Your kids are doing well, your staff seems pretty happy, but you're not really doing anything in particular to be getting that result. And there are a lot of schools that are out there like this. The problem is that replication of success is not likely. You can have staff turnover or slowly your school demographics change or what have you, and all of a sudden you end up down here and you're losing ground, but you're just not sure what happened. So if you're implementing with higher fidelity, then you end up where you're either learning, which is a great place to be because you know what you're trying to do and you're doing it well, and you're just kind of waiting for it to have an effect on outcomes. Implementing score PBIS is a great example in that we don't necessarily immediately see outcomes, and with freshmen that's going to be the case. You have to wait a few months. You have to give it time to take effect, and then hopefully we end up in this sustaining area where we are implementing with fidelity and we're also experiencing high outcomes. And this is kind of the golden ticket, right? This is where we all want to be. And that really shows, though, that once we're implementing something with high fidelity, then we can start seeing that it has an impact on our outcomes. So again, looking at the relationship of these two, we really need to look at fidelity first. And so we have to know the answer to the question, did we do what we're going to say we were going to do, before we can ask if it worked. And so with your freshman initiatives or your freshman efforts, you want to look at fidelity of your initial teaching. Did all the teachers actually teach the lessons that you gave them? Are people actually sticking to those agreements that you implement? And then are people giving those acknowledgments? So you want to check the fidelity of those things, and then you can take a look at whether or not it's working. You can look back at those ABCs that Brigid talked about, and then you can develop, you can test the skills. So for example, in our curriculum, we have what we call the knowledge test. It's just a curriculum-based measure that looks at if we teach students how to use a planner, can they tell us how to use a planner? Of course, the best thing would be to actually go look and see if they're using those planners. But in the interim, we can get at least did they access the knowledge. So with your freshman efforts, I just want to close with this recommendations for implementation, which really hold true across the board, whatever you're implementing. And these are just some kind of broad reminders. First being just not to stop doing what already works. You know, some people were asking in the chat box earlier about you know, freshman teaming or houses. If you already have a freshman house in place and it's working for you, keep doing it. And you can just add some of this teaching and reinforcing and teacher agreements pieces on top of that. So really take an inventory of what's working for you at the freshman level and keep those things in place. Also, this notion of evidence-based, of course, that goes true with anything. And then we mentioned this idea of looking for the smallest change that's going to produce the largest effect. And that's true, especially, I think, with in our conversation today with those freshman expectations, the knowledge and skills we want them to have, and then also with teacher agreements. I was describing this to a group on Fridays. We want those teacher agreements to have a big impact on kids, but a small impact on teacher time. And so we don't want to come up with, again, a laundry list of things that are going to drive our teachers crazy. So keep that in mind. The smallest change that will produce the largest effect. And then, of course, monitoring fidelity and outcomes, and make sure that if you're adding something on the freshmen, that you're also making room for it. Oftentimes, teachers and our initiative list gets really long, and so just make sure it gets blended in and really gets described how these initiatives are going to work together. So I wanted to leave a few minutes at the end. Here is the contact information for Brigid and I. I know that Michelle had some closing conversation she wanted to do with you, and then we just wanted to leave a few minutes for any questions or follow-up.
Thank you so much, Mimi and Brigid. This was excellent. I'm sure that the participants got a lot out of it. What I'm wondering with people who have attended is, can you indicate either in the chat box or send an email if this is something that you are considering implementing? What would you like in terms of some kind of a community? I know me and Brigid have some other states that are also interested in doing some implementation, so we're just looking for what people think would be the best avenue to take. Oh, I am recording the session, yep, and I see it will be posted on our YouTube page, and I am not seeing any comments at this point yet by anyone. Oh, I see, okay. Bradford team is feeling positive about what they're doing, what's working, finding ideas from the session. And I think that's it for right now. We're happy to have been able to get Mimi and Brigid to come and talk with you about this. We're looking forward to hearing back from you what your thoughts are and whether or not you would like more support. So please feel free to email either me, Michelle Paulzine, or Jill Koenitzer from the West region, or Liz Gabler from the South region, as well as the contact information for Mimi and Brigid here. And any other closing thoughts, Liz or Mimi or Brigid?
No, thank you all for attending, and I hope you found it helpful, and we're happy to follow up with you, Michelle, based on any as we move forward.
Thanks, Michelle, and everybody who listened. See, there's a question of where your YouTube page is.
Oh, sure. Access our YouTube page from the Wisconsin PBIS Network.org homepage. There is a link for that. Otherwise, on YouTube, it is the Wisconsin RTI Center YouTube page. And you'll see we have other webinars that have been recorded posted there as well.
Also, wanted to add, before you log off, you can access the PowerPoint under the materials section too if you want to do that before you log off.
Yep, and I'll leave it open just for a little bit yet because I need to do a few mechanics with the system before I log off. Okay, well, thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everyone.